Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the January 2024 Living Environment Regents Exam. We're going to be looking at Part A, which is 30 multiple choice questions, starting with number 1, which says that homeostasis in single-celled organisms is maintained through the proper functioning of what? It's the proper functioning of organelles. Homeostasis is your body's or an organism's way of maintaining balance, right? So in a single-celled organism, right, you don't really have antibodies, guard cells, or estrogen because these are these are things that are found in multicellular organisms, right? So like big complex beings like humans, dogs, cats, things that are made up of multiple cells. Organelles, on the other hand, are found in all cells, including single-celled organisms, right? And organelles work together to keep a singular cell alive. So number 2 says, in a stable ecosystem, each niche is usually occupied by one species. The species occupying a particular niche is able to continue to remain there as a direct result of what? Well, ecological succession is wrong because ecological succession kind of refers to starting a new environment. So for example, if you had a big forest that all of a sudden went up in flames and burned down, and then it turned into like a plot of dirt, and then over time grass started growing on that dirt, that would be ecological succession, right? But the fact that that grass remains in that environment is not or the fact that that grass has a niche is not explained by ecological succession. It's actually explained by favorable adaptations, right? So, the thing is, each part of an environment has a very specific place, right? So, for example, if you are, I don't know, living in a rainforest and you are a bird, right? You tend to live in the uh, upper part of the rainforest, right? You tend to live in the trees rather than in the ground, right? If you are, for example, a sloth, you instead of living on the actual leaves of the trees and the upper branches, you live on the branches. If you are a I don't know, for example, a snake, you might live on the ground. And the fact is that each of these have a very specific role. The bird will, for example, go to the ground and eat seeds, and then the snakes will then eat the birds that land on the ground, or the snakes might crawl up the tree and eat the sloth, but they're all able to do this because they have evolved to fit that very specific role. The birds have evolved to have a certain like wingspan to allow them to efficiently fly up and down these massive trees, or the snake might have adapted to have like very good eyesight so that it could see the birds that are swooping down, and it could kill it and eat it properly, right? So the reason that they are able to continually survive in this niche, the reason that the snake is forever able to survive on the floor of the rainforest is because it is adapted. It is adapted to that environment, right? And it's adapted in such a way that allows it to effectively survive in that environment, right? So number 3 says that when exposed to ultraviolet UV light, the human skin cell produces the protein melanin. This protein helps protect skin cells from damage caused by UV light. This is an example of what? Well, what is this question saying? It says that when exposed to UV light, humans' skin produce proteins, right? So what does that mean? That means that in response to an environmental factor, for example, sunlight emits UV radiation, right? This UV radiation is then absorbed by our skin, and all of a sudden we start producing melanin. We start producing proteins. But guess what has to happen when you produce a protein? You have to transcribe a piece of DNA, right? How do we make proteins? Where do proteins come from? Proteins come from our DNA, right? We have our DNA, then we transcribe it into mRNA, right? And then we translate that mRNA into protein, right? And that protein in this case is melanin. But what caused this change actually is an environmental factor, right? That UV light activated something within our gene or something within our DNA that then triggered that DNA to replicate, triggered that DNA to transcribe into protein, and then triggered that protein to translate into melanin, right? So its environmental factors affect gene expression. So the UV light affects how we express melanin. So number 4 says that the human pancreas contains cells that secrete insulin. Only these cells produce insulin because of what? Well, number 1, cells eliminate the parts of genetic code that they do not use. This is false, right? Cells actually have, all of your cells, except for your sex cells, have the same 46 chromosomes in them, right? Nothing is deleted. Number 2 says all other cells lack the genes for insulin production. This is also false because otherwise number 1 would be true. All of your cells have except for your sex cells. So aside from sperm and egg cells, everything else has the exact same 46 chromosomes packed the exact same way, right? 3 says different cells use different parts of genetic information that they contain. Yeah, this would be correct, right? All of our cells, right? They all have a nucleus, and that nucleus, they all have those same 46 chromosomes. They have the same genetic information, but the replicative machinery, the thing that transcribes that and replicates that DNA, only transcribe and replicate specific parts of DNA when it comes to produce proteins or when it comes to actually functioning, right? So, for example, your muscle cells, right? Cells that are in your muscle when you like flex. These cells located inside your muscle are going to use different parts of your genetic information to I don't know, maintain myosin or maintain like the high amount of mitochondria that they need, or this to maintain their specific structure, right? And this might be different than the cells in your pancreas that have enzymes and proteins that produce insulin, right? But at the end of the day, they have the exact same identical genetic makeup. It just expressed differently. And number 4 says they are the only cells associated with digestion of sugar. This is false because think about what your stomach cell. Cells in your stomach, cells in your small and large intestine, those definitely digest sugar, right? So different. The key point here is that all of your cells except for sex cells have the same amount of DNA. It's just they use different parts of it. So number 5 says in humans, 2 organ systems work together to move oxygen throughout the body and deliver it to the cell. Which system directly delivers oxygen to body cells? Well, it would be the circulatory system, because the respiratory system, and this is kind of a trick question. It's kind of tricky because obviously you can eliminate nervous and digestive. Because digestive does what? Digestive breaks down food into energy for your body to use, and the nervous kind of sends signals to control your body, so to move and to breathe and to I don't know, decide to make a YouTube video, right? That's what your nervous system does. But here, respiratory and circulatory, these are 2 very similar or tricky answers. It asks us which delivers oxygen, right? So it cannot be respiratory, because respiratory is what oxygenates the blood. Your lungs, they don't push that blood all over the system. What they do is they allow oxygen, or O2, right, to enter your body. And then it allows it to put that O2 into your blood cells. So, for example, your blood cells, you need oxygen to live, right? Why? Why do you need oxygen to live? You need oxygen to live because of cellular respiration, which is what makes ATP, and you need ATP to move, to breathe, it's the energy source, right? So when that O2 is used up, those blood cells now have CO2 in them, right? And CO2 is bad. So those blood cells go back into the lungs, where you now breathe in new O2, and your lungs pretty much take out that CO2, right? And put in that O2 into the new blood, right? So now the only thing the respiratory system really does is it just filters your blood. It filters out the carbon dioxide in your blood, and it adds oxygen to your blood. Then what ends up delivering that oxygenated blood outside of the lungs is your circulatory system. It's the many arteries and veins that are leading into and out of your lungs, right? So it's all the blood vessels. It's your heart that actually pumps and actually like flows new and old blood, oxygenated and deoxygenated blood throughout your body. So it'd be your circulatory system. Number 6 says currently turtle populations are decreasing in September. In September 2018, a scientist stated that turtles contribute to the health of many environments, and that the decline of turtles may lead to negative effects on other species. Which statement best summarizes the scientist's statement? Living organisms interact with and are dependent on their environment and on each other. Before reading the other ones, I'd say this is correct, right? Number 2, turtles are very large animals and thus have a negative effect on their environment wherever they live. This is false, right? Because no one said that turtles are large animals in his statement. Nowhere here does it say that turtles are bad or that they're large animals. They can be small. Number 3 says if organisms have a negative effect on their environment, there is probably a technological fix available. Though this may be true, that's not what he said. He said nothing about technology. And number 4 says the decline of turtles will not really matter because relatively few humans rely on them for food. This is a summary, right? This is an opinion, but it's asking us for a summary. Nowhere here did he talk about humans needing food. What he did say was that when turtle populations go down, so when there are no more turtles left, it's bad for other animals, right? It leads to negative effects on other species. So when you don't have turtles, the environment suffers. And guess what this one says? This one says that living organisms interact with and are dependent on their environment and on each other. So living organisms are dependent on each other because they interact with one another. If the population of other animals decreases when the population of turtles decrease, that means that they are dependent on one another because the population of one depends on another. So number 7 says, which set of substances are molecular building blocks that directly form some of the complex organic molecules present in humans, right? So which set of substances, so there's going to be multiple substances, and they're going to be building blocks. They're going to be building blocks that directly form some complex organic molecules. So each one of these choices, right, each one of these choices has to make up a organic molecule, like within itself, right? So for example, each one of these choices, you need water, and water is going to be a building block for a complex organic molecule, right? So it has to just be that choice. And it has to form a complex organic molecule, so it has to form something that is made up of many other molecules and something that has a very interesting structure. So for example, like a DNA. A DNA is a complex organic molecule because it has a bunch of like twists and turns, and it's made up of sugars and phosphate groups and nitrogenous bases, right? It has a lot going on in it. And a protein can also be a complex organic molecule because it's made of organic things, same thing with DNA, but it also has a bunch of twists and turns and sheets and functions and binding sites, and it's very complex because it's made up of a bunch of things. So those are some examples of complex organic molecules, and I could eliminate choices 1 and 2 because oxygen isn't a building block for anything, right? You can't make a giant protein or DNA out of just oxygen alone. Same thing with water. If you have a bunch of water, you have like a lake. That's it. Like, it doesn't build anything, right? Starch and nitrogen, the same thing, right? Nitrogen isn't directly responsible for building any like complex molecule or anything like that. Carbon dioxide and proteins, the same thing happens here. Although protein complexes do exist where it's like one protein plus another protein make like one super protein with a bunch of complicated things. For example, like hemoglobin, where it's like hemoglobin is a protein made up of 4 other proteins. Carbon dioxide doesn't make any complexes, right? There's no there's no just molecular complex that's made out of CO2, right? CO2 is CO2. You have a bunch of CO2, guess what? You have smoke. And it leaves us with choice 4 by process of elimination, glucose and amino acids. And you could kind of figure this out because guess what? Amino acids, when you have a bunch of amino acids together, AA plus AA plus AA, all these amino acids form to make a long chain of protein, right? So a long protein chain. So amino acids are building blocks, right? All the rest of these were not building blocks for any other molecule really. And glucose makes glycogen. And glycogen is this like large complex molecule, which it's like kind of this long web of just sugar, all bound to one another and stores a bunch of energy in it, right? So amino acids and glucose are both building blocks to these long chains of they form long chains with one another to make these complex molecules, right? So number 8 says the diagram below represents a process that occurs in many cells. The main function of this process is to what? Well, what process is this? This is DNA replication. How did I know this was DNA replication? Well, number 1, you're going from a double-stranded. This has 2 strands, strand number 1, strand number 2, and you're then creating 2 copies of it, 2 double-stranded copies. This is also double-stranded, strand 1, here's strand 2, and this is also double-stranded, which is strand 1, strand 2. Now, the second way I knew that this was DNA replication is because here we have a thymine, and here we have a thymine. Remember that DNA has thymine, and RNA has uracil, right? So because we're going from something that has T to another thing that has T, we know that this is DNA replication, right? And we know that DNA replication is needed for what? And that's what this question is going to answer. DNA replication, of course, is needed to provide exact copies of genetic code before cell division, right? Because this is going to produce two identical copies of itself, right? Produce variations in cell before asexual reproduction. That would be a mutation. Also, that's not a process. That's a random chance. 2, synthesize antigens needed to combat immunity. This would be false because if you want to synthesize antigens, you would make proteins. So this process would be mRNA to protein. And 4, make proteins needed for cellular metabolism. That would once again be mRNA to protein. But here what we're doing is we're copying our DNA into 2 so that we can then split, because the DNA that we just copied is now going to go to our daughter cell, right? So here we have 1 cell, and if I want to make another cell, if I want to split this into 2 cells, both of them need to have the same DNA inside one another. But in order to get that, I need this one cell to have double the DNA, which I'm going to get by replicating my DNA. So number 9 says, which interaction is an example of a competition between two species? So mice and chipmunks eating sunflower seeds at a bird feeder, mold growing on a turtle that has fallen in a forest. This is not competition because mold growing on a tree that has fallen in the forest. This tree is now dead. This mold is now decomposing, right? So the tree is dead. How are you going to compete with something that's dead? Doesn't make sense. Number 3 says a coyote feeding on the remains of a squirrel killed on the road. This isn't competition because what? You can't compete with something that is dead. The car cannot eat it, right? So the car killed it, and then the coyote found the dead body and ate it, right? So there's no competition going on because it's just eating or interacting with the environment. And number 4 says a lion stalking, killing, and eating a zebra. This is also not competition because it's just being a predator, right? If there was another lion present, then yeah, maybe there would be competition. But what's happening here is that that's the process by which he gets his food, right? And there's no other lions to stop him. So number 1, mice and chipmunks eating sunflower seeds in a bird feeder is competition because they're both doing the same thing. They're eating the same food within the presence of one another. So yeah, they are competed because there's limited amounts of sunflower seeds there. Everything else here was just either number 1, an animal just acting alone, or number 2, an animal interacting with something that was already killed and with something and there were no other animals present here. So for competition, you need 2 different species to be present in one moment doing the same activity. Right. So number 10 says one important reason that humans have a significant effect on the Earth's ecosystem is that what? Humans remove large amounts of carbon dioxide from the air. Humans are able to increase the amount of finite resources. Humans can modify the environment through technology, or they can reproduce faster than other animal species. This is false because we don't. It takes 9 months to make 1 human. It takes 6 months to make 6 dogs. So we don't reproduce faster than other species. We don't affect the Earth's ecosystem because we remove large amounts of CO2. We actually add large CO2, large amounts of CO2 into the air through our cars, through these factories, through our airplanes, right? So now that leaves us with choice 2 versus choice 3. We are not able to increase the amount of finite resources. For example, oil is a finite resource. We can't make more oil unless we all die and then 1 million years passes and we form oil ourselves, right? So number 3, we can modify the environment through technology, and we can either modify it in a good way or a bad way. So for example, the invention of the car was a new technology, but it modified our environment by increasing our CO2 output because the cars use CO2. At the same time, we can modify our environment by developing new technology to discover new amounts of oil, right? Or use more oil, which then leads to more greenhouse gases and us changing our environment more by increasing the temperature. Or we could develop new deforestation techniques that allow us to chop down and cut through forests much quicker, right? So we affect our ecosystem because we have all this technology. Number 12 says that within 10 years of the introduction of a new mosquito spray, very few descendants of the targeted mosquito population were killed by the usual dose of the spray. So what happened here? And they're asking us what's the best explanation. Well, what happened here was that we introduced a new mosquito spray 10 years ago, right? Let's just say that this is it goes and it sprays out there. And at some point, it was really useful and it killed all the mosquitoes. But then 10 years went by, and now the same spray cannot kill mosquitoes, right? You spray the exact same amount, and the mosquito is still alive, right? So why could that happen? Number 1 says ingesting the spray caused the mosquito to become resistant to it. This is false because this is a change that happened over 10 years. If spraying a mosquito with a spray made it more resistant to that, it wouldn't have taken 10 years for everything to be resistant. Right? Number 2 says the spray polluted the water in which the mosquito deposited their eggs. This doesn't mean that the mosquitoes are now resistant to it. This just means that this would do the opposite, right? Wouldn't that kill more mosquitoes if the poison got to their babies first? Number 3 says the spray killed organisms that caused decreases in. Oh my goodness. The spray killed organisms that cause diseases in the mosquitoes. This is you can't know this for a fact, right? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But the fact is that the mosquitoes themselves have become resistant to the spray, right? The more that you spray it, the less that it affects the mosquito. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that after 10 years after the spray was used, all of a sudden the mosquito population is greater. The question is not saying that. The question is saying that the mosquitoes themselves are affected way less by the spray when you directly spray them. So it doesn't matter if their population is increased or decreased. What matters is that the mosquitoes themselves are no longer affected by the spray, which leaves us with number 4. It says existing variations in the mosquito population provided resistance to the spray. One mosquito could have had a mutation, right, that made the spray not effective anymore, and then it had a bunch of kids that also had that resistance gene, and then they just adapted to not react to the poison at all, right? So number 13 says, once implanted into a recipient, bioengineered blood vessels made from plastic-like material become covered with the recipient's own cell. An advantage of using these bioengineered vessels is what? Well, it has to be that they do not trigger an immune response, right? So think about it. You have these the biggest issue when you have something entering your body, you have a foreign object that doesn't belong in your body entering your body, is that it triggers an immune response, right? An immune response. And this is bad because, for example, if you're donating kidneys, right? If you're an organ donor, you have someone else's organ inside of you, and that causes your body recognizes what belongs inside of you and what doesn't belong inside of you. It recognizes that, hey, this organ isn't my own organ. This is a foreign body, and guess what? It has disease, and I need to kill it. And the same thing happens if you were to like swallow, like a piece of metal, right? If you swallow a piece of metal, your immune system is going to attack it because that metal has bacteria and germs on it that are really bad for you. And the same thing happens when not just organs, but you have like a metal implant that's implanted in you, or you have some foreign body inside of you. Your body is going to start attacking that because it doesn't belong there. So what's happening here is that bioengineered blood vessels made from a plastic-like material become covered with the recipient's own cells. So because you're covering this thing entering your body with your own cells, your body now thinks that it belongs there, right? It's like it has no antigens on it. It because you're obviously your body is used to yourself, right? Your body isn't going to attack its own skin cells because guess what? It's your own skin cells. It can recognize what's you and what's not you. So if you cover this implant in what is you, which are these skin cells, guess what? It's not going to detect an issue because it's just going to detect that thing that's covered in your own cells as your own, right? So it doesn't trigger an immune response. Number 14 says, unlike telephone messages that pass over telephone wires, messages between parts of the body are carried by a series of nerve cells that are not in direct contact with one another. Communication between two nerve cells is represented in the diagram below. Which statement best explains how the message is delivered, even though these cells are not physically connected to one another? So you can see, you should know this, that it's contacted by neurotransmitters. This cell is going to release molecules that are then going to bind to this end of the cell and carry the response forward, right? So it's the release of molecules called neurotransmitters. And even if you didn't know that, you can kind of figure that out here. These black things are actually the neurotransmitters that are then going to enter the synaptic cleft, bind to here, and then carry the response forward, right? So cells communicate with the use of chemical messengers between them. That's the best answer choice here. This is what I just said. Number 15 says a saltwater aquarium contains a variety of saltwater fish and plants. Members of a species of a small fish from a freshwater stream were accidentally added to the saltwater tank. Within an hour, all the fish that were added were dead, while the saltwater fish were still healthy. The freshwater fish most likely died because they became severely dehydrated due to the process of diffusion. There's a reason why you have saltwater animals and not saltwater animals. Freshwater animals are things that can survive in low salinity environments. Saltwater animals are animals that can evolve that have evolved to survive in high salinity environments. Why is drinking really salty water bad for you? Why is drinking seawater bad for you? Because it has a bunch of salt in it, right? Yeah, sure, it's water. You need water to live, but you need water that doesn't have salt, right? Because if you drink salted water, it's actually going to dehydrate you. And it's going to do the opposite of hydrate you. It's going to take more water out of you because that's what salt does. Salt draws water from people and from things. So now imagine you're covered in salt. Your skin is going to become irritated. You're not going to be happy because salt is going to dry you out. What these saltwater animals have are these adaptations that allow them to be resistant to the salt. So the salt doesn't drive moisture out of them, right? So all of a sudden you have these things that are susceptible to salt, and you put them in a salt environment. The salt's going to do damage, right? Number 2 is wrong because salt would do the opposite. It wouldn't cause you to take in too much water. It would cause the water to leave, right? Had no freshwater organisms to eat in the saltwater tank. Starvation has nothing to do with this. It has to do with the salt, right? And I guess I'll explain it further. What this means is that if you are put in a high salinity environment, so for example, if you're put in water that is very salty, this is you, and this is your environment. NaCl, 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 NaCl. Nature wants to go from a high salinity to low salinity, right? So in a sense, and it wants to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. Inside of you, there's very few NaCl. Outside of you, there's a bunch of NaCl. So the universe wants there to be an equal amount of NaCl and H2O. H2O, H2O. It wants there to be an equal amount of H2O and NaCl inside and outside of the cell. So because you have no salt to offer, the only way that and you have a bunch of H2O inside of you, right? So the only way that I can make balance is by making this H2O leave yourself, so that the outside is more like your inside. So the outside has more water, just like you, right? So water is going to then leave your cell for that reason. Number 16 says that an energy pyramid containing green plants and other organisms from a food chain is represented below. Herbivores most likely be located in level 2 only. Right, level 1 is going to be the producers, level 3 is going to be like apex predators or predators in general. So it can't be level 1 and 3. It would have to be level 2 only. Right, so this is an axolotl. Cute. The axolotl, also known as the Mexican walking fish, can regenerate parts of a body such as a leg and a tail. The regeneration of these parts involves the process of what? Well, it has to be mitotic cell division, right? If you want to make more copies of a cell, you have to undergo mitosis. Mitosis is the process by which you make identical copies of yourself. So if you copy your cells enough, so many times, they're going to then form like these clusters, right? And then those cells, if they pile on one another, you can actually end up growing a brand new limb. So it has to be through mitotic cell division. Fertilization would be if you wanted to make a brand new axolotl. Biotechnology, there's no technology here. They evolved to be able to do this. And selective breeding, humans did not breed axolotls to be able to regrow their limbs. They did that themselves, right? So number 18 says which would most likely control an insect pest and be least harmful to the environment, right? So eliminating the plants that the insect pest feeds on. This would be false because guess what? What if animals that belong in that environment also feed off of that plant? And because you took away that plant, you also took away natural animals' source of food, which is really, really bad, right? So that would cause a lot of harm. Number 2 says using traps baited with sex hormones that attract the insect pest. Um, I'd say that this is a valid choice, right? Because it's sex hormones that attract the insect pest. These are very specific hormones for the insect, right? So 2 would be the correct answer here, because it's only going to attract insect pests and it's going to trap them, right? Other animals that belong in an environment aren't going to fall for these traps because they're not going to be attracted to them like the pest. Number 3 says releasing important insects that prey on the insect pest. This is also bad because guess what? What if these insects that prey on the insect pest, they also don't belong in that environment, right? So you're trying to deal with an invasive species by introducing another invasive species. What if, for example, their population goes out of control? What if they start eating all the grass in the area and all the grass in the area in addition to the pests, right? Then they ruin the environment further. This is what happened in Australia when they had like a cricket outbreak, or like they had a rabbit outbreak, and by that I mean like there was a bunch of rabbits there and they were really killing off the environment. So in order to combat that, British government kind of threw in a bunch of snakes into the environment, and they lost control of the snake population. And sure, the rabbits were all killed, but then guess what? They now had to deal with a brand new snake infestation. Number 4, spraying the insect areas with insecticide would be also bad because it could be harmful to the plants and animals there. Number 19 says which statement concerning the function of cells is correct? Mitochondria transfers energy from organic compounds to form ATP molecules. I'd say that this is correct, right? Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. You go from organic molecules such as glucose, and you form ATP. Vacuoles are sites of DNA synthesis. That's false. That's the nucleus. The nucleus stores genes that will later be removed from the cell. Genes are not removed from the cell. The cell membrane prevents the diffusion of all poisons into a cell from its environment. That's also false because then poison wouldn't work. If the cell membrane stopped poison from coming into the cell, then it wouldn't be poison. No one would be affected by it, right? The cell membrane cannot stop everything from coming in. Number 20 says that a photograph below shows the result of a deadly wildfire in California in 2018. What is most likely expected to occur in this ecosystem in the future? Will it eventually restore itself, but be very different from the original? Not really, right? Because who's to say that you can't that those same trees can't regrow in the same area, right? The ecosystem will eventually restore itself and be similar to the original. This is true because guess what? Just because these trees burn down doesn't mean that it's not a suitable area for another forest to come back and regrow into. The climate could be good for a forest. The amount of moisture in the soil could be good, or nitrates in the soil can be good for the environment, or for a forest ecosystem, right? So just because one forest burned down doesn't mean another forest can grow from there. The ecosystem will be completely reestablished after 6 months. You can't know that it's going to be established after 6 months, and the ecosystem will be unable to reach a state of stability again. You also don't know that. That's not guaranteed. What you do know is that you had a forest environment. You had an environment that could support a forest before the fire. Then the fire killed all the forest. But guess what? It didn't kill the environment. The environment is still there. It's still suitable to grow a forest. You just need to replant those trees. Right, so 21 says, the kittens below were born in the same litter. The kittens in the same litter often have similar characteristics, such as fur, texture, and markings, because they what? Because they inherited similar genes, right? The time that you were born doesn't matter. What matters is that they came from the same mommy cat and dad cat that had, for example, dark and light fur. For example, if the mother had light fur, then this cat could have inherited its light fur from the mother, right? And this is just how they get the markings in general. Marking is going to be genetic. Fur texture is going to be genetic. If you have a hairless cat and it has babies with another hairless cat, its offspring, its kittens, are going to be hairless because it doesn't have the gene for hair, right? So they all inherit similar genes because they all came from the same parents, right? Milk doesn't really affect this, right? Because the genes were already transferred during fertilization, and the fact that they develop in the same environment doesn't necessarily matter. Number 22 says damage to which structure would most directly interfere with the nutritional needs of a developing embryo. That would be the placenta. The placenta is kind of this organ that directly transfers blood and waste into and out of the embryo, right? So if placenta was destroyed, also the umbilical cord actually connects to the placenta. So that the placenta is like the main center for which nutrients come in and out of that baby, right? So if the placenta was destroyed, then guess what? There's nothing to feed into the child anymore. There's nothing to take out of the child anymore, right? So nutrients go into the placenta, and then they go from the placenta through the umbilical cord to the baby. Number 23 says the body's inability to regulate blood pH could affect what? The enzymes that function within the circulatory system. The red blood cells' ability to fight infection. This is false because red blood cells don't fight infections. 3, white blood cells' ability to carry oxygen. This is also false. These two are mixed up, right? They should be the other way around. White blood cells fight infections. Red blood cells carry oxygen. 4, it could affect DNA that controls starch digestion in the circulatory system. Maybe, but number 1 is a better answer, right? Because enzymes operate at a specific salinity, they operate at a specific pH level, and they operate at a specific temperature. If the pH level is out of balance, that means that the enzymes function poorly, or they can't function at all, right? So, for example, if you have a high pH, a protein could denature. And enzymes are usually made out of proteins, but same thing with enzymes, right? If an enzyme looks like this when the pH is 7, if you decrease the pH to 2, the enzyme can now look like this. And guess what? The very specific shape that binds to this enzyme can no longer bind to this enzyme, right? So think about the pH level as something that affects protein and enzyme function. Number 24 says, test anxiety and stress can trigger many responses in the human body. It can stimulate increased heart and respiratory rates and increase sweating. These physical responses to increased stress are example of what? They're example of feedback mechanisms, right? It's not gene manipulation because no genes are being manipulated here. You don't need a gene to have a heart beat quickly. That's just a response, right? It's not an infection because anxiety isn't an infection. In competitions, well, yeah, that's not what they mean by competitions here. Competition between animals, guess what? That's not it. These are examples of feedback mechanisms. If you are in a high stress environment, for example, there is a predator that is in front of you and it is about to eat you. You need to be stressed. You need to increase your heart rate so that you are ready to fight, or that you have enough blood in your system to run away. You need to increase your respiratory system so that you have the most oxygen in your body so that you can produce the most ATP and have the most oxygenated blood so that you can have high movement. High sweating, you want to be able to regulate your body temperature during these high bouts of movement that you're getting ready to do, right? So these are all feedback mechanisms to a stressful environment. Number 25 says a self-sustaining ecosystem in a glass tank must include what? Well, if you're self-sustaining, that means that you don't need any external source of energy. So the environment needs to be able to produce its own source of energy, right? And I mean energy in the source in the terms of food, right? So normally you have producers, and producers are the things that make the energy for the environment. They take H2O and they take CO2, and they take water. Sorry, they take light, right? Sunlight, and they produce their own food and they grow. And then herbivores then consume producers, and then um, predators then consume those herbivores, right? Or carnivores would consume those herbivores. But the fact is, those herbivores were able to grow because they got the energy from the producers, and those producers were able to grow because they got the energy just from their environment. And then once everyone dies, decomposers come in, and they decompose the dead animals, right? And they release nutrients into the soil, which allow producers to grow, right? So what I'm trying to get at is that choice number one kind of has what I was talking about, right? It has producers, decomposers, light, and water. You need light so that the producers can undergo photosynthesis. You need water so that the producers can undergo photosynthesis, and you need decomposers so that you can restore and replenish resources back into the soil where the producers came from, right? If you don't have decomposers, what's going to happen is you're just going to have a bunch of dead plant corpses, and you're going to run out of space. You need those decomposers to get rid of those dead plants so that there's more space for brand new plants to come out of and to grow out of. Heterotrophs, water, and carbon dioxide doesn't make sense because if you're a heterotroph, you can't make your own food. If you have a bunch of like earthworms, and you put them in a glass tank with water, they're all going to die because they're not going to have any food, right? And decomposers, heterotrophs, light, water, and carbon for the exact same reason. If you put a bunch of things that do not make their own food in an environment that does not have any food, guess what? Even heterotrophs, even if you put like predator and prey, eventually the prey needs something to eat too. And that thing that they eat is going to be plants, right? And eventually all the predators are going to kill off all the prey and everyone's going to starve, right? Herbivores, consumers, decomposers, and water. This is missing the key factor of producers because guess what? What are the consumers going to consume, right? Obviously the predators are going to consume the prey, but what is the prey going to consume? They have no water. Sorry, they have no plants or producers to consume. The 26 says a scientist examined 39 tree species from warm and cold areas of the earth and found that the trees were able to regulate their leaf temperatures, keeping them about 21 degrees Celsius. This meant that the tree leaves were able to be cooler than the environment in warm areas, but warmer than the environment in cool areas. This is an example by what? This is an example of maintaining homeostasis by responding to environmental change, right? So you're maintaining homeostasis because you're maintaining your temperature and you're reacting to an environmental change. For example, the day and night cycle. Things are colder at night and warmer during the day, so you need to cool off your leaves during the day and warm them up during night, right? Failing to respond to environmental conditions, that's the opposite, right? They're able to regulate themselves to 21 degrees Celsius. They're not decreasing evaporation for cooling during evening hours because they're also increasing. This has nothing to do with evaporation. What this has to do with is the fact that you're maintaining temperature. Number two says controlling carbon dioxide release during daylight hours. That's also false because this has nothing to do with temperature. Number 27 says a diagram below represents a food web. Two carnivores represented in this food web are what? Well, what does that carnivore have to do? A carnivore has to eat other animals, right? So, for example, it cannot be a deer because guess what? Deer eat plants, not other animals. It can't be mice because mice eat plants, not other animals. It can't be grasshoppers because guess what? Grasshoppers eat grass, not other animals. So we're left with wolves, snakes, toads, and raccoons. Deer and mice we just eliminated. Grasses and grass. It also can't be grasses because grasses don't eat anything other than sunlight and water, right? It can't be deers and wolves. It can be toads and snakes because snakes eat toads and mice, and toads eat grasshoppers, right? So number 28 says a sea slug found along the eastern coast of North America is known to have an interesting relationship with algae. The sea slug incorporates part of the algae into its tissue. This allows the sea slug to directly use energy from the sun. Which structure from the algae would the sea slug need to accomplish this? It would need chloroplasts to accomplish this, right? The algae is green because of the chloroplast. The chloroplast is where photosynthesis occurs because it's where you have water in combination with CO2 and sunlight to produce energy, right? So you need chloroplasts for that. Number 29, mitochondria, on the other hand, is how you produce ATP. Chloroplast is how you would produce sugar from the sunlight. Number 29 says, which three processes usually result in the greatest variety of possible genetic combinations, right? So you would definitely need mutations for this, because the greatest variety is usually the way that genes vary in an environment is through random mutation, right? A lot of our adaptations came from random mutation, and This seems to be the only choice with mutation. So yeah, um, meiosis, because meiosis is where crossing over happens. It's a mix-up between two parents. So if you want kids that vary, you don't want them to inherit 100% of your DNA. You want those kids to inherit 50 from you and 50 from your partner, right? Because then you have a mix and you have something unique. And fertilization is how that happens, right? Um, Differentiation is not how you have different possible gene combinations. Differentiation happens when you're actually developing and you start to form your own organs. Cloning is false because cloning produces direct copies of one another, and differentiation, say for the same reason, is false, right? So fertilization is correct, would be correct, because that's how you that's when a mother and a father DNA would mix together during fertilization. Meiosis would be correct because that's what leads to sexual reproduction, which is what you need to even initiate fertilization. And mutation is correct because mutation is the way that you have random changes in DNA. So moving on to number 30, it says that all the genetic information necessary for the growth and development in a sexually reproducing animal is present in what? Well, here we need to grow and we need to develop, right? So it's not going to be egg cells or sperm cells, right? If the question was what is necessary for us to reproduce, what is necessary for an organism to reproduce and pass its genome? Yes, you need either sperm cells or egg cells or sperm cells, right? What they're asking for is growth and development, and that would be zygote. And a zygote is a diploid. It's a diploid cell that forms after fertilization, right? After fertilization occurs. So, a zygotes then would develop into a fetus, an embryo, and then a fetus, and then actually a living creature, right? So, in order for development, you need those two copies. Oh, you need that combination or those 46 chromosomes, 23 from your mom, 23 from your dad. You need them to combine during fertilization to form a zygote or a fertilized cell from which you can develop and differentiate into. All right, so that was the entire video. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below.